"I pity any man saddled with her," said Lady Beaumont, down the length of her own dinner table, in the particular carrying undertone of a woman who wishes to be overheard by everyone except the person she is discussing. A woman who would rather quote Linnaeus at the fish course than trouble herself with a single word of conversation about anything a gentleman might actually wish to. "What is her name?" The Duke of Marchbanks had not spoken above 3 sentences all evening, and every guest at that table knew it, because Emery Blackwood's silence at social gatherings was so reliable a feature of his character that hostesses had long since stopped attempting to draw him out and simply arranged their seating charts around the fact of it. He spoke perhaps twice a dinner, when spoken to directly, and otherwise ate his meal and watched the room with an expression nobody had ever successfully read. He had just interrupted his own aunt mid-sentence, which nobody at that table had ever once seen him do to anybody. Lady Beaumont's mouth remained open for a full second on a word she had not finished delivering. "I beg your pardon, Emery, you were describing a young woman at this table in terms I confess I could not entirely follow, aunt, given that you have not yet told me which lady you mean, or what her name is." He set down his wine-glass with the particular deliberate calm that his household staff had learned, over years of service, to recognize as the outer edge of his temper, rather than the absence of it. "I find I am considerably more interested in the name than in whatever unflattering portrait you were constructing around it." Henrietta Cole sat 2 places down from Lady Beaumont, in a dress that had been remade twice and pressed with more care than fashion, and felt the whole table's attention shift toward her with a suddenness that made her hands go still in her lap. She had heard worse. That was the plain truth of it, and she had walked into Lady Beaumont's dining room that evening already braced for exactly the kind of remark that had just been aimed at her. Because she had spent 4 years as her aunt's poor companion, invited to precisely the gatherings where her presence was tolerated and her opinions were not. And she had developed, across those 4 years, a fairly comprehensive private catalogue of the ways a room could be cruel to a woman with no fortune and too many opinions about botany. What she had never once heard, in 4 years of enduring exactly this kind of dinner, was a duke interrupt a countess mid-sentence to ask a stranger's name. "Her name," said Lady Beaumont, recovering her composure with visible effort, "is Miss Henrietta Cole. She is a distant connection of the Ashworth family, presently companion to my own cousin, and I was merely observing, Emery, in the general spirit of dinner conversation, that a woman with such particular scholarly enthusiasms is not perhaps best suited to Miss Cole." Emery Blackwood turned his full attention down the table, past his aunt entirely, to the woman in the remade dress, who had gone very still under the weight of 30 pairs of curious eyes. "What were you saying before my aunt began describing your character to the rest of us in the 3rd person? I believe I heard the word Linnaeus mentioned, and I find I would rather hear the remainder of that thought from you than a summary of it from anyone else." The table held its breath. Henrietta Cole had spent 4 years learning precisely when to speak and when silence served her better, and she understood, with a clarity that steadied her hands even as her heart hammered, that this particular moment offered no safe version of silence at all. That a duke had just handed her, in front of 30 witnesses, the exact opening Lady Beaumont's cruelty had been designed to deny her, and that declining it now would cost her considerably more than accepting it might. "I was observing to Mr. Aldous," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, "that Linnaeus's system of classification, whatever its early flaws, transformed the study of the natural world from a gentleman's idle curiosity into something considerably closer to a genuine science. Because before his binomial nomenclature, Your Grace, a botanist in Yorkshire and a botanist in Vienna might spend a decade corresponding about the same plant under two entirely different names, each convinced the other had discovered something new. I find that a rather more interesting fact than most dinner conversation affords, though I confess I understand it is not to everyone's taste. It is entirely to mine, said the Duke of Marchbanks. Please continue. I find I have been eating this same fish course in silence at dinners exactly like this one for 11 years, and I cannot recall the last time anyone offered me a fact worth actually chewing on alongside it. Lady Beaumont did not recover for the remainder of that dinner, and the table's attention, having been so publicly redirected, did not return to her for the rest of the evening. She had built the whole gathering, in fact, around a purpose considerably more calculated than idle cruelty. Her own goddaughter, Miss Arabella Finch, an heiress of £40,000 and a face the ton had spent 2 seasons admiring, sat at the Duke's other side that evening, placed there by Lady Beaumont's own careful arrangement, and the Countess had spent a full month engineering precisely this dinner in the hope that proximity and a well-orchestrated evening might finally move her nephew toward the match she had been quietly promoting since Arabella's debut. Henrietta Cole's presence at that table had been, in Lady Beaumont's own private accounting, a minor inconvenience, a poor relation, invited only because her employer, Lady Beaumont's cousin, could not attend without her, and easily enough managed with one well-placed remark that would put the unfashionable creature back in her proper corner of the room's attention before she could accidentally distract from the evening's actual purpose. She had not accounted for her own nephew's silence breaking. For the first time in 11 years of careful social withdrawal, over precisely the woman she had meant to dismiss. The dinner continued for another hour after that exchange, but the room's whole texture had shifted, and Lady Beaumont knew it. Watching her nephew lean fractionally toward the unfashionable companion at the table's far end with an attentiveness he had never once shown Arabella Finch across 3 months of careful engineering, she said little for the remainder of the evening, and what she did say was uncharacteristically brittle, and Mrs. Fenimore, seated near enough to observe the Countess closely, remarked to Henrietta in the carriage home that she had never in 20 years of acquaintance seen Lady Beaumont so thoroughly unseated by a single sentence not her own. "You have made an enemy tonight, my dear, whether you intended it or not," Mrs. Fenimore said, not unkindly. "A woman like that does not forgive being upstaged at her own table, and she will not forgive it quietly." "I did not upstage her, ma'am. I only answered a question I was asked. I know it. I do not think that particular distinction will trouble Lady Beaumont's memory of the evening in the smallest degree." He called on Henrietta 3 days later, not at Lady Beaumont's house, where such a visit would have been remarked upon by the whole household within the hour, but at the modest town-house, where her employer, Mrs. Fenimore, kept a small establishment during the season. And he came with a book under his arm rather than flowers, which struck Henrietta, opening the door herself because the household kept only 2 servants, as considerably more promising than any bouquet could have been. "I have brought you the Linnaeus," he said, without preamble, "the full Systema Naturae, in the Latin, because I discovered upon inquiry that the English translations available in most London bookshops are rather badly abridged, and I did not think a woman who quotes the original at dinner would thank me for an abridgment." "You did not need to bring me anything, Your Grace." "No. I wanted to, which I find is rather a different motivation, and one I have not felt with any particular strength in a very long while." He held out the book, and she took it, and something in the careful weight of it, 3 volumes, bound in good leather, clearly not a casual purchase, told her plainly that he had spent more than an idle afternoon on the errand. "May I ask you something, Miss Cole? And I would ask that you answer it honestly rather than politely, because I find I have had a great deal of politeness this week and very little honesty." "You may ask." "Why did my aunt choose you?" of everyone at that table to make an example of. I have turned it over since Tuesday, and I cannot make the arithmetic come out simply as unfashionable dress and scholarly enthusiasm. My aunt has sat through duller conversation than yours, without ever once troubling to publicly dismantle the speaker. Henrietta considered the question a long moment, turning the heavy volumes over in her hands. I do not know the whole of her reasoning, Your Grace, though I have my suspicions. I believe your aunt has spent this whole season arranging a match between yourself and Miss Finch, and I believe she had built this particular dinner around exactly that purpose. And I believe a woman who occupies even a small corner of your attention at such a dinner is a woman your aunt would rather remove from the field entirely before she becomes an actual complication. She met his eyes steadily. I do not say that to flatter myself into more significance than I actually hold, Your Grace. I had exchanged perhaps 4 words with you before Tuesday evening. I say it because it is the only explanation that accounts for the particular viciousness of the remark, which struck me, even at the time, as considerably more personal than the ordinary carelessness of a hostess managing her seating. Emery Blackwood was quiet a moment, absorbing that. You are very likely entirely correct, he said finally. My aunt has mentioned Miss Finch's suitability to me no fewer than 11 times this season, by my own count, and I have declined to act on any of the 11 mentions, which I gather has begun to try her patience considerably. He turned his hat over in his hands. I find I would like to know you properly, Miss Cole, entirely apart from whatever my aunt's arithmetic makes of the acquaintance. May I call again? You may call whenever you like, Your Grace, though I would ask you to understand plainly what you would be calling on. I have no fortune, no fashionable connections beyond the Ashworth name I hold at a considerable remove, and considerably more opinions about botanical classification than any drawing-room generally wants from a companion. If your aunt's objection was cruelty dressed as observation, I would not have you mistake the observation itself for entirely false. I am precisely as unfashionable as she said. I did not ask to call on fashion, Miss Cole. I asked to call on you. He came every week through that spring, and their conversations ranged considerably further than botany, though botany remained, by unspoken agreement, their most reliable common ground. Henrietta had been educated, unusually for a woman of her circumstances, by a clergyman father with more learning than income, who had taught his only child Latin and natural philosophy alongside her needlework, because he could not, he had told her once, bear to raise a daughter who knew nothing of the actual world she lived in. He had died 4 years before, leaving her with an education considerably beyond her fortune, and no family willing to shelter a clergyman's bookish daughter for longer than politeness strictly required, which was how she had come to Mrs. Fenimore's household as companion, managing correspondence and household accounts in exchange for a room and a small wage that left very little over for the fashion Lady Beaumont's dinner had so pointedly found her lacking. Emery told her, in turn, of 11 years spent perfecting a silence that had begun. He confessed one May afternoon in Mrs. Fenimore's small back garden as genuine grief, and had calcified, over time, into simple habit. My father died when I was 21, and my mother the year following, and I inherited a title and an estate and a great many people who wished to tell me precisely what a duke ought to say at dinner, and I found the easiest way to disappoint none of them was to say nothing at all. He watched a bee work methodically through the lavender at the garden's edge. I have spent 11 years being praised for a silence I did not choose so much as retreat into, and I confess I had entirely forgotten, until Tuesday, that I possessed the capacity to interrupt anyone about anything. What made you interrupt her? I watched your face while she was speaking, Emery said. You did not flinch, and you did not look at the ground, and you held yourself exactly as though the remark had cost you nothing at all, and I understood, watching that particular composure, Precisely how many times it must have been practiced to look that effortless. I found I could not sit through the practicing of it one moment longer without at least learning the name of the woman doing it. Lady Beaumont's campaign, once her original arrangement had so publicly failed, did not end with the dinner. It simply changed shape. She could not attack Henrietta Cole's character directly a second time without drawing precisely the attention she had hoped to avoid the first time. So she turned instead to a considerably more patient cruelty, quiet remarks dropped in the right drawing rooms, carefully seeded doubts about the suitability of a duke's attentions to a companion with no fortune, and by June, the whispers had grown substantial enough that Mrs. Fenimore, Henrietta's own employer, found herself receiving pointed questions from her own acquaintance about whether she oughtn't to release Miss Cole from her position before the association became a genuine embarrassment to the household. "I do not wish to let you go, Henrietta," Mrs. Fenimore said, distressed, in the first week of June. "You have been the best companion I have ever employed, and I do not credit half of what Lady Beaumont's circle is whispering. But I am an old woman with a small establishment, and I cannot afford to have my own household's respectability questioned over a duke's private inclinations, and I find myself in rather an impossible position." "What are they actually saying, ma'am? I would rather know the whole shape of it than guess." "That you have set your cap at a duke considerably above your station, and are managing the acquaintance with more calculation than affection. That a companion who quotes Latin at dinner parties has learned the trick of making herself interesting to bored noblemen, and that any sensible household would remove such a woman before her ambitions cost her employer's own reputation alongside her own." Mrs. Fenimore's mouth thinned with distaste at having to repeat it. "I do not believe a word of it, my dear, but I have heard it repeated in 3 drawing rooms this week alone, which tells me Lady Beaumont has been considerably busier than idle gossip generally requires." Henrietta understood, hearing it. Precisely the shape of what Lady Beaumont had actually built, not a direct attack, which Emery could simply defend against, but a slow starvation of her circumstances, designed to make the acquaintance itself too costly for anyone connected to Henrietta to sustain. She did not go to Emery with it immediately, because she had learned, across a spring of his company, that he would move at once to solve any difficulty she brought him, and she found she wanted, this once, to solve the difficulty on her own footing, before she asked for his help at all. She went instead to Arabella Finch. It was, she reflected afterward, rather a bold thing for a companion, with no fortune, to call upon the very heiress her benefactress had hoped the Duke might marry. But Henrietta had watched Arabella closely enough across 3 social gatherings that spring to suspect the young woman held considerably less enthusiasm for her godmother's matchmaking than Lady Beaumont's confident campaign suggested. "Miss Finch, I have come to ask you something directly, because I find I have had entirely enough of things being managed around me rather than through me, and I would rather hear your own account than continue guessing at it." Henrietta sat across from her in the Finch family's morning room, her hands steady, though the calling itself had cost her considerable nerve. "Your godmother has spent this whole season arranging a match between yourself and the Duke of Marchbanks. I have watched you at 3 separate gatherings since, and I confess I have not once observed you behave as a woman eager for that particular outcome. Am I mistaken?" Arabella Finch, 22 and considerably more direct than her fashionable reputation suggested, set down her tea with something that looked remarkably like relief. "You are not mistaken in the smallest degree, Miss Cole. I have known the Duke of Marchbanks since we were children. Our estates border one another in Kent, and I confess I have always regarded him with precisely the affection one holds for an agreeable cousin, which is to say considerable fondness and not one particle of romantic interest. My godmother has spent a full season building a match neither of us has ever wanted, and I have not known how to tell her so without wounding her considerably, given how much of her own hope she has invested in the scheme. Then, may I ask you to tell her now? Because her disappointment has begun falling rather heavily on me, instead of on the actual obstacle to her plans, and I find myself losing my position over an engagement that was never going to happen, regardless of anything I do or say. Arabella Finch went to her godmother that same week, and the conversation, by every account that reached Henrietta afterward, was considerably more direct than Lady Beaumont had ever permitted herself to be with anyone. I have never wanted to marry Emery, Aunt Beaumont, and I have told you so at least 4 times this season, though I confess I did not say it firmly enough for you to properly hear it, because I did not wish to disappoint you. Arabella's account of the conversation, relayed to Henrietta days later with some private amusement, suggested her godmother had gone very white indeed. I understand you have built this whole campaign around securing my future comfortably, and I am grateful for the care behind it, however misdirected. But I will not have Miss Cole lose her position and her good name simply because you have spent a season pursuing a match that was never going to happen, whatever pressure you apply to the people standing in its way. She has no fortune, Arabella, no connections worth the name. A duke who marries a companion invites the whole of society's ridicule. A duke who watched a companion hold her composure through a deliberate public cruelty and then spent a whole spring learning to actually see her properly is a duke who has found something considerably rarer than fortune, Aunt, and I think you know it, which is precisely why you have fought it so hard. Arabella's voice, by all accounts, had not risen once through the whole exchange. I will not marry to please you. I will not watch you ruin an innocent woman's livelihood to clear a path toward a match I never wanted. You must choose which battle actually matters to you, because you cannot win both. Lady Beaumont did not yield gracefully, and her final effort in the last week of June was considerably more direct than anything that had come before it. She went to Mrs. Fenimore herself, not with rumour this time, but with an outright offer, a settlement, generous enough to secure the old woman's household comfortably for years, in exchange for Henrietta's dismissal within the fortnight and a character reference careful enough to ensure she found no comparable position anywhere in London afterward. Mrs. Fenimore, to her very great credit, came to Henrietta with the offer laid out plainly rather than acting on it in secret. She has offered me £800, Henrietta, to be rid of you quietly and see that you cannot easily find another place. I want you to know the whole of it, because you have a right to decide what happens to your own life, and I will not have it decided behind your back the way everything else in this business seems to have been. Henrietta sat with that for a long moment, feeling the particular vertigo of discovering exactly how much a countess was prepared to spend to be rid of her. What will you tell her? I have already told her no, Mrs. Fenimore said, with a firmness that surprised them both. I am an old woman, and £800 is a very great deal of money, and I told her no within the first minute of the offer. Because I have watched you manage my household and my correspondence for 4 years with more honesty than any of my grander acquaintance has ever shown me. And I will not sell that honesty for any sum a vindictive countess cares to name. Henrietta went to Emery that same evening. At last, because she had decided that whatever the difficulty had cost her to solve alone, he deserved to know the whole shape of what his aunt had actually attempted. He listened to the entire account in a silence that had by then become considerably easier for her to read than it had been at Lady Beaumont's dinner table. She understood, watching his jaw tighten through the telling of Mrs. Fenimore's offer, that this particular quiet was not withdrawal, but a very carefully controlled fury. £800, he said finally, to have you dismissed and blacklisted, so that a match neither party ever wanted might proceed unobstructed by an inconvenient companion's continued presence in my company. He was quiet a moment longer. I owe you an apology, Henrietta, for not seeing the shape of this sooner. I knew my aunt was displeased. I did not understand she had moved to actively destroy your livelihood over displeasure alone. You are not responsible for your aunt's cruelty, Your Grace. No. But I am responsible for what I do about it, now that I know the whole of it, and I find I have been considerably too passive about my own family's behavior for 11 years, hiding behind a silence that let a great many things go unaddressed simply because addressing them required more of me than I wished to give. He took her hand, which she permitted, because 4 months of careful courtship had earned him exactly that much trust. I am going to speak to my aunt myself, plainly, and I am going to do it in whatever room produces the most witnesses, because I find silence has served this family's cruelties considerably better than it has ever served its honesty. And I am finished contributing to that particular arrangement. He confronted Lady Beaumont at her own dinner table the following week, in front of the same guests who had watched the whole business begin 4 months before. A deliberate symmetry, Henrietta understood, he had chosen precisely because he wanted the correction delivered in the same room, before the same witnesses, that had watched the original cruelty go unanswered by anyone but himself. Aunt Beaumont, I understand you offered Mrs. Fenimore £800 to dismiss Miss Cole and ensure she found no further position in London. His voice was not raised, but it carried, in the particular flat, final way she had come to associate with the version of him that had first interrupted her insult in April. I would like to know, in front of this table, exactly what you believed that money was purchasing, because I have turned the arithmetic over considerably, and I cannot make it come out as anything but an attempt to destroy an innocent woman's livelihood to clear a path toward a marriage that Arabella herself has told you, repeatedly, she never wanted. Lady Beaumont's face had gone the colour of the tablecloth. Emery, I only wish to protect this family's standing. You wished to protect your own scheme, aunt, and you were prepared to ruin a woman with no fortune and no family to defend her in order to do it. That is not protection. That is cruelty dressed up in a family's good name, and I have watched you practice it twice now on the same woman, and I find I have had entirely enough of watching. He looked around the table, at guests who had, 4 months before, watched him ask a stranger's name, and were now watching him finish what that question had started. I am going to say this once, plainly, in front of everyone at this table, so that there is no confusion afterward about where I stand. I intend to marry Miss Henrietta Cole, if she will have me, and any member of this family who continues to treat her with anything less than the respect owed a duchess will find their welcome in my houses considerably diminished. That is not a threat, aunt. It is simply an accounting of what I intend to protect from this day forward. And I find I am no longer willing to be silent about it. He asked her properly 2 days later, in Mrs. Fenimore's small back garden where the lavender emery had once watched a bee work through, was now in full summer bloom, and he did it plainly, without any of the performance a lesser proposal might have required. I have spent 11 years perfecting a silence that let a great many cruelties go unanswered, and 4 months learning, from watching you hold your composure under exactly that kind of cruelty, precisely how much courage a quiet life actually requires. He took her hand among the lavender. I do not want a duchess who will simply endure this life beside me, Henrietta. I want the woman who quoted Linnaeus at a dinner table designed to humiliate her, and held her chin level through the whole of it, and taught me, without ever meaning to, that a duke's silence is not the same thing as a duke's peace. That is not quite a proposal, Your Grace. I am aware. I find I have grown considerably more careful with important words this spring, which makes them rather harder to simply say. He smiled, the particular rare smile she had learned, over 4 months, to treasure precisely because of its rarity. Marry me, Henrietta, not because my aunt's cruelty made a spectacle of asking your name, because I have spent 4 months learning who you actually are beyond that name, and I find I cannot imagine the rest of my life without her in it. They were married that autumn, and Arabella Finch stood as witness, having become, in the months since her own honest refusal of her godmother's scheme, something considerably closer to a genuine friend than either young woman had expected. Lady Beaumont did not attend, though she wrote, eventually, the following spring, a letter that was not quite an apology, but was, Henrietta always said, considerably closer to one than the woman had ever managed before, admitting, in careful, unpracticed sentences, that she had mistaken her own fear of her nephew's continued isolation for a need to control his choices entirely, and that she had done a great deal of damage in the mistaking. Henrietta kept the letter and answered it, and the two women never became close, but they managed, over the years, a careful civility that neither had thought possible in the summer of Lady Beaumont's final defeated scheme. Arabella Finch married, 2 years later, a quiet naturalist she had met, as it happened, through the Duchess of Marchbanks's own botanical correspondence, and told Henrietta at her own wedding breakfast that she considered the whole tangled business of that dreadful dinner the accidental making of her actual happiness, since she would never otherwise have discovered how little she wanted the match her godmother had spent a season engineering. The Duchess of Marchbanks maintained, at her husband's own considerable expense, a small botanical garden on the estate's south lawn, cultivated according to Linnaeus's own system and open, every Thursday, to any tenant's child curious enough to learn the Latin names of the plants growing in their own fields. You could simply enjoy the garden privately, Emery said, one warm evening, finding his wife instructing a cluster of farm children in the proper pronunciation of a particularly stubborn genus name. You need not turn every pleasure into a lesson for the whole county. I spent 4 years being told my particular pleasures were unsuited to polite company, Emery, by a woman who very nearly cost me my livelihood over the saying of it. Henrietta did not look up from her small, attentive audience. I find I would rather spend the rest of my life proving her wrong in the most public manner available to me than keep any part of what I love a private, apologetic thing ever again.